On June 1, 1953, in the bustling maternity ward of Beth El Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, a baby boy entered the world under circumstances that would shadow him for the rest of his life. The infant, initially named Richard David Falco, was the product of an extramarital affair between Betty Broder and Joseph Kleinman. In the conservative climate of 1950s America, such circumstances carried a heavy stigma that would profoundly impact the child's psychological development. Betty Broder, already married to Tony Falco, found herself pregnant by her lover Joseph Kleinman, a married businessman who showed little interest in taking responsibility for his illegitimate son. The shame and scandal of the situation weighed heavily on Betty, who was already struggling with her own mental health issues and a troubled marriage. Unable to cope with raising another child under such circumstances, Betty made the difficult decision to give up her son for adoption. The baby spent his first few days of life in the hospital nursery, unnamed and unwanted, while arrangements were made for his future. This early abandonment would become a defining trauma that would echo throughout David's life, contributing to deep-seated feelings of rejection and worthlessness. After several days in limbo, the infant was adopted by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a Jewish couple from the Bronx who had been trying unsuccessfully to have children of their own. They renamed the boy David Richard Berkowitz and brought him home to their modest apartment, hoping to give him the loving family environment he deserved. Nathan Berkowitz was a hardware store owner who worked long hours to provide for his small family. He was a kind but distant man, more comfortable with the nuts and bolts of his business than with the emotional needs of a growing child. Pearl Berkowitz, on the other hand, was an overprotective mother who smothered young David with attention while simultaneously communicating her own anxieties and fears. From an early age, David displayed troubling behavioral patterns that set him apart from other children. He was hyperactive and prone to violent outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere. His adoptive parents, well-meaning but unprepared for such challenges, struggled to understand and manage his behavior. David's earliest memories were filled with confusion and anger. Even as a small child, he seemed to sense that something was different about his family's situation, though he wouldn't learn the truth about his adoption until much later. The feeling of being somehow wrong or different permeated his childhood, creating a foundation of insecurity and rage that would only grow stronger with time. At school, David was a problem child from the start. Teachers reported that he was disruptive, aggressive with other students, and seemed incapable of following basic rules. He would explode into violent tantrums over minor frustrations, sometimes attacking classmates with such ferocity that other parents complained to school administrators. His academic performance was inconsistent. He showed flashes of intelligence but seemed unable or unwilling to apply himself consistently. More troubling was his fascination with fire and violence. Even as a young child, David was caught setting small fires in waste baskets and seemed mesmerized by the flames and destruction they caused. As David entered adolescence, his behavioral problems intensified rather than improved. He became increasingly isolated from his peers, spending long hours alone in his room or wandering the streets of the Bronx. His adoptive parents, now in their 60s and struggling with their own health issues, found themselves unable to control or even understand their troubled son. During this period, David began exhibiting signs of what would later be recognized as serious mental illness. He reported hearing voices that seemed to come from inside his head, voices that urged him to commit acts of violence and destruction. At first, these auditory hallucinations were relatively mild, whispered suggestions to break things or hurt animals. But as time went on, they became more insistent and more specific. David's relationship with his adoptive mother Pearl was particularly complex and troubling. As she aged and became more frail, her overprotectiveness transformed into a suffocating neediness that David found both comforting and infuriating. When Pearl was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1967, David's world began to collapse entirely. The sight of his adoptive mother wasting away from cancer triggered something primal and terrifying in David's psyche. He became obsessed with death and suffering, spending hours at Pearl's bedside watching her deteriorate. When she finally died in 1967, when David was just 14 years old, the last stabilizing influence in his life was gone. Nathan Berkowitz, devastated by the loss of his wife and overwhelmed by his son's increasingly erratic behavior, withdrew even further from David's life. The father and son lived in the same apartment but existed in separate worlds, connected only by shared grief and mutual incomprehension. Pearl's death marked the beginning of David's rapid psychological deterioration. The voices in his head, which had previously been occasional whispers, now became constant companions. They took on distinct personalities and began issuing specific commands that David found increasingly difficult to resist. At age 18, David made a decision that would remove him temporarily from his toxic environment but ultimately accelerate his journey toward violence. He enlisted in the United States Army, hoping that military discipline and structure might provide the stability his life had always lacked. The Army initially seemed to help David. The rigid structure and clear expectations provided a framework within which he could function relatively normally. He served as a sharpshooter and became proficient with various firearms, skills that would later prove tragically relevant to his criminal career. But even the Army couldn't suppress the darkness growing within David's mind. His fellow soldiers found him strange and unsettling. He would sit alone for hours, seemingly carrying on conversations with invisible companions. Sometimes other soldiers would catch him talking to himself in his bunk late at night, his voice alternating between his own and what sounded like responses from someone else. After serving for 3 years, David received an honorable discharge in 1974 and returned to New York. But the city he came back to seemed alien and hostile. The voices in his head, which had been somewhat quieted by military routine, returned with renewed intensity and malevolence. Back in civilian life, David struggled to find his place in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic and threatening. He took a series of menial jobs, security guard, cab driver, postal worker, but couldn't maintain steady employment for long. Employers found him unreliable and disturbing. Co-workers avoided him after witnessing his habit of talking to himself and his sudden, inexplicable outbursts of anger. It was during this period that David learned the truth about his adoption and began a search for his biological parents. The revelation that he was adopted came not from his father Nathan, but from a private investigator David had hired to help him understand his origins. The knowledge that he had been given away as an infant reopened old wounds and created new ones. When David finally tracked down his biological mother, Betty Falco, in 1975, the reunion was far from the healing experience he had hoped for. Betty, now remarried and living in suburbia, was uncomfortable with David's sudden appearance in her life. She reluctantly admitted to being his mother but made it clear that she had no desire to develop a relationship with him. The rejection was devastating. David had fantasized about finding his birth mother and finally understanding why he felt so different, so wrong. Instead, he was rejected once again, this time by the woman who had brought him into the world. The meeting lasted less than an hour, and Betty made it clear that she didn't want him contacting her again. This second abandonment pushed David further into his private world of voices and violent fantasies. The demons in his head, which had been relatively quiet during his search for his mother, now returned with unprecedented fury and specificity. They began telling him exactly what he needed to do to make the pain stop. By 1975, David Berkowitz was living alone in a squalid apartment in Yonkers, New York, barely maintaining his sanity through sheer force of will. The voices in his head had evolved from vague whispers into a complex hierarchy of demonic entities, each with its own personality and agenda. The most prominent of these voices claimed to be a 6,000-year-old demon named Sam, who spoke through David's neighbor's dog, a black Labrador named Harvey. According to David's increasingly elaborate delusions, Sam was the leader of a legion of demons who had chosen David as their earthly instrument. Sam's commands were specific and urgent. David must kill young women, particularly those with long, dark hair, in order to provide blood sacrifices to the demon army. David's apartment became a shrine to his delusions. The walls were covered with bizarre writings and crude drawings depicting demons, violence, and death. He wrote long, rambling letters to himself from Sam, detailing the missions he was expected to carry out. His handwriting during these episodes was noticeably different from his normal script, as if someone else was guiding his hand. Neighbors in David's apartment building began to complain about strange noises coming from his unit, talking, arguing, and sometimes screaming in the middle of the night. When concerned residents knocked on his door to check on him, David would claim that he had been watching television or listening to the radio, but the sounds they heard didn't match any programming that might have been on the air. The final trigger came in the form of a letter David claimed to have received from Sam through the neighbor's dog. The message was clear: the time for preparation was over. The killing must begin immediately, or David himself would face the wrath of the demonic legion. On July 29, 1976, David Berkowitz purchased a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver from a gun shop in the Bronx. The weapon felt comfortable in his hands, familiar from his army training, and perfectly suited for the close-range work Sam had commanded him to perform. As he carried the gun home, David felt a mixture of terror and excitement. The voices in his head were louder than ever, a cacophony of demonic whispers urging him forward, telling him that his destiny was finally at hand. That night, he loaded the revolver and set out into the streets of New York, hunting for his first victim. On the early morning of July 29, 1976, David approached a car parked in the Bronx where two young women, Donna Lauria and Jody Valenti, sat talking after a night out. Both women had long, dark hair, exactly the type Sam had specified as preferred victims. Without warning or provocation, David pulled out his .44 and began firing through the passenger window. Donna Lauria, just 18 years old and fresh out of high school, was killed instantly by a bullet to the head. Jody Valenti was wounded but survived, though she would carry both physical and psychological scars for the rest of her life. David fled the scene immediately, exhilarated by the violence he had just committed and the knowledge that he had finally obeyed Sam's commands. Back in his apartment, David carefully cleaned his weapon and wrote a detailed report to Sam about the successful completion of his first mission. The voices in his head were pleased, he believed, but they were also hungry for more. The killing of Donna Lauria was just the beginning of what would become a reign of terror that would grip New York City for over a year. The murder of Donna Lauria was initially treated as an isolated incident, possibly a robbery gone wrong or a case of mistaken identity. But David had no intention of stopping with one victim. The voices in his head were insatiable, demanding more blood, more terror, more proof of his devotion to their cause. 2 months later, on October 23, 1976, David struck again. This time his victims were Carl Denaro and Rosemary Keenan, both 20 years old, who were sitting in a parked car in Flushing, Queens. David approached from behind and fired several shots through the rear window. Denaro was struck in the head but survived, though he required extensive surgery and suffered permanent disabilities. Keenan was uninjured but traumatized by the experience. The attack on Denaro and Keenan established what would become David's preferred method of operation, approaching couples in parked cars late at night and opening fire with his .44 caliber revolver. The choice of weapon was significant. The .44 was powerful enough to be lethal even through car windows and doors, and its distinctive sound would eventually become a signature that police would learn to recognize. After each attack, David would return to his apartment and conduct elaborate rituals of gratitude to Sam and the other demons. He would write detailed accounts of the shootings, describing not just the physical details but also the spiritual significance of each killing. In his delusional worldview, every victim was a sacrifice that brought him closer to his ultimate destiny as Sam's chosen instrument of terror. The police investigation was hampered by the apparent randomness of the attacks and the lack of any clear motive. The victims didn't know each other, came from different neighborhoods, and had no obvious connections that might explain why they had been targeted. What investigators couldn't see was the twisted logic that guided David's choices. His victims were selected not for who they were, but for what they represented in his elaborate delusion. As 1976 turned into 1977, David's attacks became more frequent and more audacious. The shootings were no longer confined to quiet residential streets. He was willing to strike anywhere he found suitable victims, regardless of the risk of detection. On January 30, 1977, David shot and killed Christine Freund, 26, as she sat in a car with her fiancé John Deal in Ridgewood, Queens. Deal was unharmed but watched in horror as the woman he loved died in his arms. The attack was particularly vicious. David fired multiple shots at close range, ensuring that his victim would not survive. The murder of Christine Freund marked a turning point in both David's psychological state and the public's awareness of the emerging threat. Media coverage of the shooting was extensive, and for the first time, investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a serial killer rather than isolated incidents. David was thrilled by the media attention. The voices in his head told him that his work was finally being recognized, that the people of New York were beginning to understand the power of Sam's army. He began keeping a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about his crimes, studying them obsessively and planning his next attacks based on what he learned about police procedures and investigation techniques. On March 8, 1977, David struck again, this time targeting Virginia Voskerikian, a 19-year-old college student who was walking home from class in Forest Hills, Queens. Unlike his previous attacks on couples in cars, this shooting took place on a busy street in broad daylight. David approached Virginia directly, pulled out his gun, and shot her in the face at point-blank range before fleeing on foot. The brazen nature of the Virginia Voskerikian murder sent shockwaves through New York City. If the killer was willing to strike in daylight on a crowded street, no one was safe anywhere, at any time. The psychological impact on the city's residents was enormous. People began changing their routines, avoiding certain neighborhoods, and looking over their shoulders constantly. By the spring of 1977, New York City was in the grip of unprecedented fear. The mysterious killer had claimed multiple victims, and police seemed no closer to catching him than they had been after his first attack. Media coverage was intensive and often sensationalized, creating a climate of hysteria that affected millions of residents. It was during this period that David decided to communicate directly with the public and the police. On April 17, 1977, he struck again, shooting Alexander Esau and Valentina Suriani as they sat in a parked car in the Bronx. Both victims were killed, but this time David left something behind, a handwritten letter addressed to NYPD Captain Joseph Borelli. The letter was rambling and bizarre, filled with references to demons, blood sacrifices, and the coming apocalypse. But it was the signature that captured the public's imagination and gave the killer his infamous nickname. David signed the letter, Son of Sam, explaining that Sam was his father, who demanded blood and would not be satisfied until David had killed many more people. The Son of Sam letter was unlike anything investigators had ever encountered. The handwriting was erratic and childlike, switching between different styles as if multiple personalities were guiding the pen. The content was a mixture of taunts directed at police, threats against the public, and rambling religious/occult references that provided disturbing insight into the killer's mental state. When portions of the letter were released to the media, the public's fascination with the case reached fever pitch. Son of Sam became a household name, and David Berkowitz found himself the center of a media circus unlike anything New York had seen before. The attention only fed his delusions and encouraged him to become even more brazen in his attacks. The summer of 1977 was one of the most tense and frightening periods in New York City's history. Son of Sam had promised in his letter that he would kill again, and the entire city waited in dread for the next attack. Police deployed massive resources to try to catch the killer, but David seemed to stay one step ahead of every effort to trap him. The psychological warfare David was waging against the city was as effective as his actual violence. Young women with long, dark hair, his apparent preferred victims, changed their appearance, cutting their hair short or dyeing it blonde in hopes of avoiding his attention. Couples stopped parking in isolated areas, and many people simply stayed home after dark rather than risk becoming the next victims. On June 26, 1977, David struck again, attacking Sal Lupo and Judy Placido as they sat in a parked car after leaving a disco in Queens. Both victims survived, though Placido was seriously wounded. The attack fit David's established pattern, but investigators noticed that his shooting had become more erratic, suggesting that the psychological pressure might be affecting his ability to carry out his plans effectively. The near miss with Lupo and Placido seemed to frustrate David, and the voices in his head became more insistent and threatening. Sam, he believed, was displeased with his recent performance and demanded a more spectacular demonstration of devotion. The result would be David's most shocking and public crime yet. On July 31, 1977, exactly 1 year after his first attack, David targeted Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante as they sat in a car near the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. The location was significant, it was far from David's usual hunting grounds and in a much more populated area. The attack itself was devastating. Berkowitz was killed and Violante was blinded in both eyes. But this time, David made crucial mistakes that would ultimately lead to his capture. Several witnesses saw him near the scene, and more importantly, he was observed acting suspiciously around parked cars in the area. For the first time in over a year of terror, police had real leads to follow. The Berkowitz-Violante shooting marked the beginning of the end for David Berkowitz's reign of terror. The attack had taken place in a more populated area than his previous crimes, and several witnesses had observed a suspicious man acting strangely near the crime scene. One witness in particular proved crucial to the investigation. Cecilia Davis, who lived near the shooting location, reported seeing a man acting suspiciously around parked cars shortly before the attack. More importantly, she had seen this same man earlier in the evening arguing with a police officer who was issuing parking tickets. When investigators checked parking ticket records for the area and time frame, they found that several tickets had been issued to cars parked illegally near the crime scene. One of these tickets had been issued to a car registered to David Berkowitz of Yonkers, New York. The discovery of David's name in the parking ticket records was the break investigators had been desperately seeking. When they ran his name through various databases, they found that he had been questioned previously in connection with some minor incidents, but nothing that had raised serious suspicions. Surveillance teams were quickly dispatched to David's Yonkers apartment building to observe his movements and gather more evidence. What they found was a clearly disturbed individual whose behavior fit the profile they had developed of the son of Sam killer. Neighbors reported that David frequently talked to himself, often seeming to carry on conversations with invisible companions. His apartment windows were covered with bizarre writings and drawings, and he was often heard screaming or arguing with someone in the middle of the night, even though he lived alone. On August 10, 1977, investigators decided they had enough evidence to make an arrest. As David approached his car outside his apartment building, he was surrounded by police officers and taken into custody without resistance. In his possession they found a .44 caliber revolver, the same type of weapon used in all the Son of Sam attacks. David Berkowitz's arrest brought an immediate end to one of the most intensive manhunts in New York City history. But investigators were unprepared for what they encountered when they began interrogating their suspect. Rather than denying his crimes or demanding a lawyer, David seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk about what he had done. The confession that followed was unlike anything experienced detectives had ever heard. David readily admitted to all the Son of Sam shootings, providing details that only the killer could have known. But his explanation for why he had committed these crimes was so bizarre and disturbing that many investigators initially wondered if he was feigning insanity to avoid prosecution. According to David, he had not acted alone or even of his own free will. Instead, he claimed to be the unwilling servant of a network of demons led by the ancient entity Sam, who communicated with him through his neighbor's dog. These demons, he explained, had commanded him to kill young people as blood sacrifices, threatening to torture him eternally if he refused to obey their orders. David's apartment, which investigators searched thoroughly after his arrest, seemed to support his claims of demonic influence, at least from his deluded perspective. The walls were covered with bizarre messages written in his own hand, depicting conversations between David and various demonic entities. Some messages were signed Son of Sam, while others bore the names of different demons who were supposedly part of Sam's army. Mental health experts who examined David after his arrest found him to be severely mentally ill, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and multiple other psychiatric disorders. The voices he claimed to hear were real to him, as were the demons he believed controlled his actions. From his perspective, he had been as much a victim as those he had killed, forced to commit terrible acts by supernatural powers beyond his control. Despite the clear evidence of David Berkowitz's severe mental illness, prosecutors decided to pursue murder charges against him. The case had generated enormous public attention and outrage, and there was tremendous pressure to see him held accountable for his crimes, regardless of his psychological state. David's defense team argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, pointing to the extensive evidence of his delusional thinking and the testimony of multiple psychiatric experts. They contended that someone in David's mental condition could not be held legally responsible for his actions, as he lacked the capacity to understand the difference between right and wrong. The prosecution countered that David's careful planning of his attacks, his ability to evade capture for over a year, and his awareness that he needed to flee after each shooting proved that he understood the criminality of his actions. They argued that regardless of his mental illness, he had made conscious choices to commit murder and should be held accountable. In the end, David himself resolved the legal dilemma by changing his plea to guilty on all charges. Against the advice of his attorneys, he admitted his guilt and accepted responsibility for the 6 murders and 7 attempted murders he had committed. The decision shocked both his defense team and prosecutors, but it was consistent with David's apparent desire to finally tell the truth about what he had done. On June 12, 1978, David Berkowitz was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would never be released from prison. As the sentences were read, David showed little emotion, seeming almost disconnected from the proceedings that would determine the rest of his fate. David Berkowitz's imprisonment at Sullivan Correctional Facility in upstate New York marked the beginning of a new chapter in his troubled life. Away from the voices and pressures that had driven him to violence, he began to experience periods of clarity that had been absent for years. In the controlled environment of the prison, with regular medication and psychiatric treatment, David's acute psychotic symptoms gradually subsided. The demons that had once commanded his every action fell silent, leaving him to confront the full reality of what he had done. The realization that he had killed innocent people, destroying multiple families and terrorizing an entire city, filled him with genuine remorse and horror. During his early years in prison, David struggled with suicidal thoughts and deep depression. The man who had once believed himself to be the chosen instrument of demonic forces now saw himself as simply a severely mentally ill individual who had committed terrible crimes. The grandiose delusions that had sustained him during his killing spree were replaced by crushing guilt and self-loathing. But gradually, with the help of prison counselors and psychiatric treatment, David began to rebuild some semblance of a functional life. He earned his GED, participated in various educational and therapeutic programs, and slowly began to develop insight into his mental illness and the factors that had contributed to his crimes. In the 1980s, David underwent what he described as a religious conversion, becoming a born-again Christian. He began corresponding with various religious organizations and eventually became involved in prison ministry work. Whether this conversion was genuine or simply another form of delusion became a subject of debate among those who knew him, but it seemed to provide him with a framework for understanding his past actions and finding some measure of peace. As decades passed, David Berkowitz evolved from the delusional killer known as Son of Sam into something quite different, a middle-aged man serving multiple life sentences who had developed genuine insight into his crimes and their impact. He began granting occasional interviews to journalists and researchers, always expressing remorse for his actions and attempting to provide whatever information might help prevent similar tragedies. In these later interviews, David was able to discuss his crimes with a clarity that had been completely absent during his active period as a killer. He acknowledged that the demons and voices had been products of his own severely disordered mind, not actual supernatural entities. He described the loneliness, rage, and sense of rejection that had fueled his violent fantasies, and he expressed genuine sorrow for the pain he had caused his victims and their families. David also became an advocate for better mental health treatment and early intervention programs. He argued that if he had received proper psychiatric care during his childhood and adolescence, the tragedies he committed might have been prevented. His case became a study in the importance of recognizing and treating severe mental illness before it leads to violence. One of the most significant developments in David's later years was his decision to waive his rights to profit from his crimes. New York's Son of Sam law, passed in response to his case, prohibited criminals from earning money from books, movies, or other media about their crimes. David voluntarily assigned any such proceeds to his victims' families, a gesture that some saw as genuine remorse and others viewed as meaningless given the magnitude of his crimes. The Son of Sam case left an indelible mark on New York City and American culture as a whole. The year-long reign of terror had demonstrated how a single disturbed individual could paralyze a major metropolitan area and forever change the lives of millions of people. For the families of David's victims, the pain never truly ended. Parents lost children, partners lost loved ones, and survivors carried both physical and psychological scars that would last lifetimes. Some family members found a measure of peace in David's later expressions of remorse, while others felt that no amount of regret could balance the scale of what he had taken from them. The case also had significant impacts on law enforcement procedures and media coverage of serial crimes. The intensive police investigation pioneered several techniques that would become standard in later serial killer cases, and the media sensationalized coverage raised important questions about the balance between public information and responsible reporting. Perhaps most importantly, the Son of Sam case highlighted the critical importance of mental health awareness and treatment. David Berkowitz's descent from a troubled but functioning young man into a delusional killer demonstrated how untreated mental illness could have catastrophic consequences not just for the individual but for society as a whole. As David Berkowitz entered his 7th decade of life, still in prison and likely to remain so until his death, his case continued to raise profound questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and personal responsibility. Was he a monster who chose to commit unspeakable acts, or was he a victim of his own diseased mind who deserved treatment rather than punishment? The answer, like so many aspects of the Son of Sam case, remained complex and unsatisfying. David's crimes were undeniably evil in their impact. They destroyed lives, shattered families, and terrorized an entire city. Yet the man who committed them was clearly suffering from severe mental illness that distorted his perception of reality and his ability to make rational moral choices. In his later years, David seemed to embody both aspects of this duality. He was a man who had committed terrible crimes for which he bore responsibility, but he was also a severely mentally ill individual who had been failed by the systems that might have helped him before his illness led to violence. The demons that once commanded David Berkowitz to kill were silent now, quieted by medication, therapy, and the passage of time. But the consequences of their reign continued to reverberate through the lives of survivors, the families of victims, and a city that would never forget the summer when Son of Sam stalked its streets. David Berkowitz remained in prison as of his later years, no longer the delusional killer who had terrorized New York, but not yet free from the consequences of the terrible acts he had committed during that dark period of his life. His story served as both a cautionary tale about untreated mental illness and a reminder that some wounds, once inflicted, can never fully heal. In the end, the man once known as Son of Sam became a symbol of the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior, a living reminder that the line between victim and perpetrator is sometimes thinner than we would like to believe, and that the demons we face are often the ones we carry within ourselves.